Hail fellow travelers, Tim from Secret Fire Books here, this time with a top 10 video for you guys, and this time around I'm going to be talking about the top 10 authors that I need to read. And what I mean by that is that these are 10 authors who have been on my radar for a while. I might have read up a little bit about them. They may have been recommended to me by friends or other people here on YouTube. I might even have some of their books in my collection, but I've never actually committed to reading any of their books myself. And I want to change that. I want to get around to reading these people sometime soon as I get all 22 of these Redwall books out of the way. But these won't be in any kind of particular order. I don't think I wrote them down in any kind of order. No, not really. But I think what I'm going to do is group them together by genre, more or less. And so I guess we'll start off with a genre that is kind of out of my comfort zone. I say that, but I'm not opposed to reading this kind of stuff. I just don't read it that often. I think reading outside my comfort zone would be more like biographies or contemporary fiction or romantasy. Excuse me, I get a little bit of indigestion every time I say that word out loud. But the genre I'm talking about right now is crime fiction. I have not really dabbled that much into crime and mystery and that kind of thing. And recently, on an episode of the Elusive Exclusive Book Society, I spoke with Jim from Mystery and Mayhem, and he recommended that if I've not yet dabbled into crime, I should really try out Raymond Chandler. And looking back on that, it should have been a no-brainer for me. I felt like I was someone being told, oh, you've never read classic fantasy before? You should read Robert E. Howard, or you should read J.R.R. Tolkien. It was like, oh, I never would have thought that. I don't know why I needed someone who's much more well-versed in this genre to tell me that. But in any case, I don't remember any of the specific books that Jim told me to read, but this book, The Big Sleep, is the first in Raymond Chandler's Detective Philip Marlowe series. So when I get around to reading crime fiction, I will most definitely start with The Big Sleep by Raymond Chandler. Looking forward to that. And next we'll get into a genre that I read a little bit more often, but not quite as much as science fiction or fantasy, and that's horror. And a horror author that I definitely need to check out more of is Robert Bloch. Now, the reason I think I'll get along with Robert Bloch's style of horror is because he's not just a horror writer. He is a weird tales horror writer. And I feel like every time I check out an author who had their stories published in weird tales that I've never read before, I really get on with their writing style. And Robert Bloch, I know his stuff is a little more psychological. Obviously, Psycho is like the ultimate psychological horror thriller story. But I really like his writing style. I read one of his short stories, The Black Kiss, recently, and it was very derivative of H.P. Lovecraft, but it was very, very well written. And so I decided I need to get more of that. I need to get more of that Robert Bloch in me. That sounded awful.
That's what she said.
Yeah, I've never read any of his novels, and I've seen the movie Psycho. It's a fantastic movie, one of the best horror/thriller movies I've ever seen. So if the book is anything like that, I'm definitely going to be very happy. And, Robert Bloch was friends with H.P. Lovecraft. He was a contemporary of all those other Weird Tales guys. So I'm assuming that I'll enjoy his stuff. Likewise, I'm assuming that I'll enjoy this next writer, who is Clark Ashton Smith. I've never read any of... That's not true. I've read one Clark Ashton Smith story, Abosathla. But it was a very short one. I don't really think I got a hold on his writing style. But I've been told many times that I'll enjoy him. And the thing is, he's kind of part of the unholy trinity of Weird Tales alongside Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, who are already two of my favorite writers of all time. And so I figure that, if he gets put on the level with those two, he's probably a writer that I'll enjoy. I need to get a hold of one of his short story collections. Most of the books that collect his short stories are out of print nowadays. That said, I think a lot of his short stories are available in Project Gutenberg, so I might need to check those out sometime soon. Getting back into my niche, back into the realm of science fiction and fantasy, we have C.J. Cherryh. C.J. Cherryh's been on my list for a long time. I've really wanted to read this series, The Morgaine Cycle, for a while. I've had the fourth book in the series, Exile's Gate, for a long time, but if you start a series, you gotta start with the first book. And I've heard that this series is very interesting. It blends sword and sorcery as well as some science fiction elements very well. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in her straight-up science fiction stories. I have a copy of her book, The Brothers of Earth, which sounds very interesting. I also have a copy of The Pride of Chinor, which is the first book in her Chinor series. I don't know if I'll read the whole series, but I definitely want to try out that first book. And I've heard good things about C.J. Cherryh. I've heard that she has a very accessible writing style. I've heard that she handles characters and themes very well. And I hear that she writes alien cultures in a very interesting way. And I'm definitely down for some of that. So I'll have to check out C.J. Cherryh sometime soon. Another female science fiction author that I have yet to check out is Andre Norton. Now, usually when Andre Norton pops up, you get one of two responses out of people. It's either people who love her books, who say, oh yeah, she's one of my favorite writers of all time, or it's people who have read a few of her books and say, she's really not all that great, she's really kind of overrated. There's very rarely any in between. But I guess if you write as many books as Andre Norton did, and she was very, very prolific, by the way, some of them are going to be really good, and some of them are going to be duds. Most of them will be duds. But the point is that she is a sort of institution in the science fiction and fantasy world for a reason. And at the very least, I've heard good things about this book, Witch World. It is an Appendix N book. It inspired Dungeons and Dragons, and it spawned a whole series of, I don't even know how many sequels this book got. But I'm sure there are quite a bit of merit to her books. I just need to check out the right ones. I think when I get started in my Andre Norton journey, I'll definitely start with Witch World. I've heard some, especially from some friends here on YouTube, I've heard some questionable things about her other books, but I think Witch World will be safe to go with. Next is an author that I don't really hear talked about all that much here on YouTube, but I am very interested in reading his stuff, and that is Frederik Pohl. Now, Ira from SF Words of Wonder, good friend of the channel, has spoken about Frederik Pohl quite a bit, and he sings the praises of his Heechee series, especially the first book, Gateway, which I do have. I do have an old book club hardcover edition of. Yeah, I've heard a lot of his stuff is kind of like proto-cyberpunk. He gets very, very gritty and kind of dystopian. I do need to check out his stuff. It sounds like a lot of fun, at the very least. And speaking of more classic science fiction, I also need to check out A.E. Van Vogt. Now, this is an author who, again, is an institution of the science fiction genre. I have quite a few of his books, and I think that if I really get started on his writing, I should probably check out his short stories. So I have this collection, The Far Out Worlds of A.E. Van Vogt. I know that he gets a little cerebral, and some people say that his stuff is kind of hard to understand. He gets a little technical with his science fiction, but I'm not opposed to that as long as it's not, ridiculously hard SF. As long as it's not, essentially paragraphs and paragraphs out of a science textbook. I think I'll be okay, but who knows? We'll see. And someone else that I've been hearing about a lot lately is Glenn Cook. Now, Glenn Cook writes science fiction, he writes fantasy, he writes a little bit of everything in the world of speculative fiction, from what I know. And every time someone talks about Glenn Cook, they talk about how mind-blowing his stories are. First of all, he wrote the Garrett P.I. series, which is apparently a series of detective stories, private investigator detective stories set in a high fantasy universe. So that sounds interesting. He also wrote the Black Company series, which sounds like a lot of fun, even though I have yet to find a copy of that first book. I find every other Glenn Cook book, every other Black Company book at the used bookstore, but it's never that first Black Company book. It makes me so frustrated. But apparently his science fiction is also really good. He writes some really interesting, epic space opera kind of science fiction. So I definitely need to check him out as well. Joseph Reed's Books has talked Glenn Cook up quite a bit. And dude, I will get there. I promise you, Joseph. I will get on that bandwagon. You don't need to wait for me. I know you finished all of Glenn Cook's books. I will catch up, okay? As for those cozy fantasy novels you've been reading lately, the guy makes friends with a demon who's possessing his body stories, you can read those by yourself, man. I don't want any part of that. You can just keep those away from me.
Don't you put that evil on me, Ricky Bobby! Don't you put that on us!
Next is another Weird Tales writer who, from what I hear, is actually really, really unique, and that's Manly Wade Wellman. Now, first of all, I just want to point out how awesome that name is. The guy's legal name was Manly Wade Wellman. I wish I had a name that awesome. But like I said, his stuff is apparently very unique. A lot of his short stories are set in and around the Appalachian Mountain area in North America, and a lot of the horror and fantasy elements involved in those stories are derived from the cultural heritage or the folklore of the Appalachians. So I think that's really, really cool. And even though he's been on my list for a while, I didn't know I needed to read him until I had a talk with Nick from the Book Graveyard a while back. Nick asked me, Tim, have you ever read Manly Wade Wellman? I said, no. And he said, dude, you need to read Manly Wade Wellman. And the thing that I've learned is that if Nick from the Book Graveyard tells you that you need to read a book, unless it's sleaze, you probably should read that book. If nothing else, it's gonna be wacky and zany and just a really wild roller coaster ride. So yeah, I need to check out Manly Wade Wellman. Again, a lot of his short story collections are out of print. There is one book you can get off Amazon, a print-on-demand book that collects all of his Silver John short stories. But I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know if I trust the print-on-demand stuff from Amazon anymore. And that's coming from a guy who sells his own self-published books print-on-demand through Amazon. And last but certainly not least is an author that I hear a lot about. A fantasy author that, quite frankly, I'm starting to get sick of hearing about. And that is Carl Edward Wagner. And the thing is, I do really want to read Carl Edward Wagner's stuff. But I am kind of getting sick of him being recommended to me. Because every time, since I started this YouTube channel, every time I talk about classic fantasy or sword and sorcery or Conan or anything like that, I just get barraged with comments asking, have you read Carl Edward Wagner? Have you read Bloodstone by Carl Edward Wagner? Have you read Darkness Weaves by Carl Edward Wagner? No, I've not read any of those books by Carl Edward Wagner. And you want to know why? Because anytime I look up any book by Carl Edward Wagner, I only get two results on the internet. One is a listing on eBay for one of his books for $900, and the other is a crappy ebook that has a bunch of typos. So no, I've not read any of Carl Edward Wagner's stuff yet. I want to. His Cain the Mystic Swordsman books sound amazing. But it's impossible to get a hold of these books. And what, you think I'm just going to run into them in the wild someday? No, that's a pipe dream. It's never going to happen. So unless someone can reprint his books, I'm not going to be reading Carl Edward Wagner anytime soon. And that's really disappointing. But that's why he's at the top of the list. So I do need to get around to Carl Edward Wagner. I could buckle down and read those really terrible ebooks. I just don't want to. I feel like it spoils the experience of reading his stuff for the first time. You know, he's an author from an era where there were no ebooks. There was no concept of e-readers or the internet or anything like that. So unfair. It is a tragic, tragic life we book collectors must bear. But that's all for now, guys. Let me know in the comments. As always, have you read any of these authors? What do you think of them? Which authors do you think I should read sometime in the near future? And until next time, guys, as always, farewell and keep reading.
That's nasty.